Hello, welcome to part 4 of our video over the New Right uh, and uh, and what's happening in the 80s. In this video, we're going to talk about what's happening around the world and the final years of the Cold War and the Reagan administration and Reagan's legacy. So this goes along with that second part of the essay question for the final, right? So that you could write about. How did Ronald Reagan impact the Cold War? It's a fascinating topic, and if you choose to write about it, it's a pretty good topic to discuss. Um, okay, so Ronald Reagan entered the office a committed Cold Warrior. He held the Soviet Union in contempt and denounced it in a 1983 speech as an evil empire. So Reagan's evil empire, referring to the Soviet Union, became a very popular slogan during the 1980s. To refer to the Soviet Union and these other states aligned with them as evil, right? As evil, and America is obviously great. Um, so also all those years of détente, right, cooperation, the easing of tensions that went on before Reagan took office sort of just fell by the wayside, right? Reagan believed that it was his duty to speed up the inevitable and end the Soviet Union, to make the Soviet Union fall apart. Uh, his Reagan doctrine declared that the United States should supply aid to anti-communist forces everywhere around the world. This meant that the U.S. government publicly stated that it would fund terrorist organizations and dictatorships around the world as long as they oppose communism, right? Because communists, they're the true enemy, not the dictators around the world, not the terrorists, but the communists. Uh, you see during this time, during the 80s, a huge height in U.S. funding of these other right wing groups. Um, and this was all done in the name of freedom, right? There's nothing more American than toppling governments, funding revolts, um, installing dictators around the world, unfortunately. And as long as the communists lost, it didn't matter how many people were oppressed and died around the world. And that was one of the core parts of this Reagan doctrine. The true enemy were the communists, and if we funded a dictator to get rid of communists, so be it. So to give this Reagan doctrine force, Reagan oversaw an enormous expansion of the defense budget. Federal spending on defense rose from 171 billion in 1981 to 229 billion in 1985, the highest levels since the Vietnam War, and this was continually increasing throughout the 80s. All the while, the U.S. national debt had unprecedented growth. Um, Reagan described this policy as peace through strength, as he phrased it, appealing to Americans who during the 1970s feared that the United States was losing its status in the world. And the way for America to preserve its status as the strongest, most powerful nation on the earth is to increase the military. So peace through strength. The best way to ensure peace is to be the strongest, right? No one wants to pick on the big kid. Now, when Reagan was elected in 1980, many Americans felt that the U.S. was losing its power around the world and was in decline. The Vietnam War is a prime example of this, ending in 1975. Um, a huge humiliation for the U.S. government, the U.S. military, and Americans felt like, oh, if we could lose to the North Vietnamese, it showed the rest of the world that we're vulnerable. And also, the U.S. giving back the Panama Canal under the Carter administration made Americans feel insecure about America's place in the world. So when Reagan got elected, the Iran hostage crisis was going on and not getting any better. The Soviet Union had just invaded Afghanistan, and many people rallied around Reagan as a strong, charismatic leader to bring America front and to make America the best again. Um, Reagan monopolized fears on during those early years that many Americans had at the time. The fears that the U.S. is becoming a number two nation, that they're becoming second best, and Americans like being the very best, right? So they rallied around Reagan as someone who would bring America up and make America great again, which was his presidential slogan. Now, Jimmy Carter had sought to promote human rights in the region, but Reagan and his advisors scrapped this approach and instead focused on fighting communism. And their main focus for this was in Latin America. Many Americans felt that after the Cuban Revolution took place in the 60s, it was a failure on behalf of the U.S. government. And when Reagan took office for the president in the 80s, he placed a lot of his focus on Latin America to prevent any more communist revolutions from taking place. So when communists with ties to Cuba overthrew the government of the Caribbean nation of Grenada in October of 1983, Reagan dispatched U.S. Marines to the island and dubbed the operation Urgent Fury. The Grenada invasion overthrew the leftist government after less than 1 week of fighting. So, despite the relatively minor nature of the mission, its success gave a huge victory for hungry Americans who wanted something to cheer about after the military debacles of the two previous decades. So the U.S. military under Ronald Reagan sent troops into Grenada to overthrow a leftist regime. So, like I said, there's nothing more American than toppling governments, right? And at the time, people ate that up. They're like, yeah, let's kick the communist butts. It's a good thing that we're in there. But Grenada was, in fact, the only time Reagan deployed the American military into Latin America. Uh, but for the United States also decided to change focus, not to directly involve itself in around the world with its military anymore. Instead, they wanted to work behind the scenes, funding insurgency groups and supporting right wing anti-communist movements in Latin America. Um, and the prime example of this um, is I'm sorry. So um, for example, from 1981 to 1990, the United States gave more than $4 billion to the government of El Salvador to oppose communists there. The Reagan administration took a more cautious approach to the Middle East. Its policy was determined by a mix of anti-communism and hostility towards the Islamic government of Iran. When Iraq invaded Iran in 1980, the U.S. supplied the Iraq dictator Saddam Hussein with military intelligence and business credits. And even after that, it became clear that the Iraq forces were using chemical weapons. And for a while, the U.S. government funded Saddam Hussein as a dictator who as long as he fought against America's enemy, Iran, the U.S. continued to fund them. But once the U.S. got word of like, hey, Saddam's creating chemical weapons, the U.S. sort of took a step back and pulled out. But the fact is that the U.S. funded Saddam Hussein to fight Iran, which was against the U.S.'s best interest at the time. And this was a common story throughout the 1980s. And there were some protests about America's involvement in the Middle East and Latin America, but one of the most controversial Cold War programs dealt with the nuclear arms race. Initially, Reagan followed examples of previous presidents like Richard Nixon and Jimmy Carter by pursuing arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union and practicing this policy of détente, right? This easing of tensions between the U.S. and Soviet Union, and sort of a recall of nuclear missiles. Uh, but American, but in the 80s, um, talks began about a strategic arms reduction talks in 1982, right? So talks of disarmament, but at the same time, these talks started to break down in 1983 when Reagan proceeded to put Pershing nuclear missiles into Western Europe to counter the Soviet SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe. So there's a good show on Hulu that I like a lot called Deutschland 83, or in German it's Deutschland 83, about a East German spy who's sent over to Western Germany to spy on the U.S. and Western Germany military command who were placing missiles into Western Germany at that time. It's a very cool show, um, but you would have to read it in subtitles because it's all in German. But it's a good show and it's on Hulu if you want to watch that. But one of the core focuses of the show is the controversial move by Reagan to put Pershing missiles into Western Germany, which greatly increased tensions between the East and the West, and especially in Germany, where if the Cold War ever got hot, right, um, the whole thing of mutually assured destruction meant that nuclear missiles would have been, you know, out of it, right? People we wouldn't use nuclear missiles, but if ever it got hot and we didn't use nuclear missiles, Western Europe, especially Germany, would be the center of World War III. So many Germans protested Reagan putting missiles in Germany itself, but Reagan said that was for their own good, right, to promote peace. Um, anyway, Reagan went a step further in March of 1983 when he announced plans for the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a space-based system that could shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. Critics dubbed this program the SDI missile program Star Wars. Um, Many people question that if the U.S. even had the technological capability of launching anti-nuclear missile satellites into space. Others said that would be way too expensive. But Reagan pushed for the Star Wars, the SDI program, and funded research into SDI. The whole thought of the U.S. shooting down any nuclear missile with the SDI system really freaked out the Soviet Union, and caused the Soviets to devote their resources to funding research for their own anti-nuclear missile programs as well, which in turn put the Soviets into more debt, which possibly hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, if the Star Wars this is the whole reason why the Soviets were so freaked out about the idea of the Star Wars program. If the Star Wars technology was real, then it would defeat the whole purpose of mutually assured destruction, which we talked about before with the nuclear arms race, right? That if either side used its nuclear missiles, it would mean the end of the world. But with the proposal of the Strategic Defense Initiative and these anti-nuclear missile satellites, if the Soviet Union ever did fire its missiles on the United States, the U.S. in theory could just shoot them all down and make the Soviet Union an open target for them. So this freaked out the Soviet Union and made them devote tons and tons of resources in their already fragile society to sort of fund their own defense initiative as well. Um, so going back to Reagan, um, while this was all happening, Reagan had to face a international scandal called the Iran-Contra affair. In 1982, the House voted 411 to 0 to approve the Boland Amendment, which barred the United States from supplying funds to Contras, a right-wing insurgency fighting left group who was fighting a leftist government in Nicaragua. Um, so the Boland Amendment restricted the U.S. from giving government money to right-wing insurgency groups. So it's like, okay, you can't fund these guys anymore. This group's bad. We shouldn't fund them. However, Reagan personally viewed the Contras as he overlooked this, and he viewed the Contras as the moral equivalent of the founding fathers. That the Contras um, opposed communism, they opposed the left, so the U.S. government should support them. Despite the whole Contras things of uh, inhumane warfare and doing some not so great things in Nicaragua. However, so Robert McFarlane and the president's national security advisor and Oliver North, a member of the National Security Council, raised money to support the Contras in secret by selling American missiles to Iran and funneling money into Nicaragua. Uh, they laundered missile money to fund the Contras, right? And not only that, they sold missiles to Iran, which was who Reagan publicly condemned and said that it's their enemy. And when the scheme was revealed in 1986, it was hugely embarrassing for Reagan. The president's underlings had not only violated the Boland Agreement, they had also, by selling arms to Iran, made a mockery of the Reagan's declaration that America will never make concessions to terrorists. Um, but for a while, the Iran Contra affair generated the same sort of scandal as the Watergate scandal. And investigators were, however, never able to prove that Reagan knew about the operation. So Reagan denied all of this from happening, right? Saying like, "Oh, I didn't support this Iran Contra affair," and largely he got off the hook for it. But at the time, because of the Iran Contra affair, because Reagan's administration went behind the scenes and sold missiles to Iran to support a insurgent group in Nicaragua. This drastically hurt the new right's gains in politics, and also it hurt Reagan's campaign and threatened his legacy. But unlike Nixon, Reagan wasn't impeached or tried to get. They didn't try to impeach Reagan. It just was a bad political move uh, and a huge controversy at the time. Also, moving back to the Cold War, the U.S. military budget skyrocketed during the this year in the 80s under Reagan's administrations, and the Soviets were desperately trying to keep up. In 1985, the aged leader of the Soviet Union, Churanenko, died, and his leadership was passed to this guy over here, uh, Mikhail Gorbachev. Who was a true believer in socialism, but nonetheless believed that the Soviet Union desperately needed to reform itself in order to survive. So this is a little random, but one of my old professors in graduate school, one of my thesis advisors, is a Russian historian, and when I went into her office, she always had like a little bobblehead of Gorbachev on her desk. So you could imagine that guy, but as a bobblehead. So every time I talk about him and stuff, I sort of think of that bobblehead guy. But he was the leader of the Soviet Union up until its collapse in 91. Um, so anyway, Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union and believed that in order to save the Soviet Union, which at the time was falling apart, he needed to modernize and change it. And one of the major policies of the Soviet Union for years and years and years since its creation was heavy censorship and banning of Western technology, right? So up until the 80s, the Soviet Union couldn't have any Western books. Many Western books were barred. They had to go through government screenings in order to be legal. Also, Western technology was banned up until the 80s as well. But when Gorbachev entered the office in 85, he thought that it would be a good thing to ease up on these technology restrictions to make it easier for people in Eastern Europe to have access to Western technology. So Gorbachev, he had good intentions for the Soviet Union, but a lot of this stuff sort of blew up in his face. Now that people had access to all this Western technology, they realized how little that the Soviet Union had. How the Soviet Union, many people felt that they were behind compared to the Western world. So it showed the cracks with already present in the Soviet system. Also, at this time, there was massive food shortages in Eastern Europe. Um, Gorbachev was sending grain out to other countries and the decolonizing world. While at home, many people had to stand in lines for hours and hours just to receive some bread, you know. So there were food shortages across Eastern Europe, which further weakened the Soviet Union. And and this, in addition to many of the other frustrations, growing frustrations, and acknowledgement of people living in the Soviet Union that they might not be in the best system, really showed the cracks in the system. Also, you have things like the Chernobyl explosion, right? HBO just came out with a really good show about Chernobyl, and it's sort of like a dramatized version of it. But I think they do a pretty good job. So you should definitely watch Chernobyl out on HBO. But that's something that also happened in the 80s, and it showed that the Soviet government may not have the Soviet people's best interest at heart. That the government's lying to the people, which also hastened its decay. Um, and one by one in 1989, in Poland and in Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and in East Germany, these member states of the Soviet Union or allies of the Soviet Union started to gain their independence. Within the Soviet Union, Gorbachev's proposed reforms unraveled the already decaying Soviet system. And remember that in 1989, I said the Berlin Wall fell. David Hasselhoff, he gave his like concert on top of the Berlin Wall. Um, so Germany was eventually united. All these other member states of the Soviet Union started to gain their independence. Uh, one by one, and by 1991, the Soviet Union itself had vanished, dissolving into a commonwealth of independent states. So the Soviet Union, America's biggest enemy since the end of World War II, just sort of fell apart overnight in 1991. It really unraveled. Now, it's debated amongst historians what exactly caused the Soviet Union to collapse. Was it the Chernobyl explosion? Was it um, food shortages? Was it the ban on Western technology? Was it the economy? Or was it Ronald Reagan? And it's very debated on of amongst historians of how involved was Reagan in the Soviet Union's collapse. And I argue that through Reagan's increase of military spending and aggressive Cold War policies, he pressured the already fragile and collapsing Soviet Union and caused it to collapse a few years later, earlier than if someone would have, and earlier than it normally would have if a person like Reagan was never elected as president, right? So Reagan really pushed. He leaned on a table that was already not secure, right? And I argue that because of that, he hastened the collapse of the Soviet Union by at least a few years, in my opinion. Um, so the Cold War was over, and the U.S. emerged successful, which was a huge thing. And going into the 90s, the U.S. was this major international power, and we see a rebirth of the United States being this huge global figure. Right? They didn't have their major enemy, but at the same time, you know, the U.S. sort of felt lost. And for that bonus lecture, I'll get into that a little bit more. But going back to Reagan, Reagan had a complicated presidency and a complicated legacy as well. But for certain, he impacted American history going into the 21st century. Um, Reagan left office in 1988 with the Cold War waning, right? Remember, the Cold War didn't officially end until 1991. Reagan left office in 88, but he already put this collapse of the Soviet Union into motion. Well, he hastened it at least. Um, and by 1988, the economy was booming, right? Uh, Unemployment had dipped to 5% in 1988. And between 1981 and 1986, gas prices fell from $1.38 to 95 cents a gallon. And remember, this is coming out of that um, whole oil embargo thing, and that took place in the 70s that caused oil prices to skyrocket. The stock market recovered from its crash, and industrial output in the United States was increasing as well. The top fifth of households enjoyed rising incomes, while the rest stagnated or declined. However, there were some bad parts of this too. So the rich got richer, while the rest of Americans sort of like stagnated. They didn't really improve. Um, Unemployment remained in the United States around 33 million at this time, so it pretty much stayed the same. And real per capita money income grew from only 2% at this time, too. So, income of the average income per family only grew by like 2% during this time. Though many jobs were created throughout the 80s, many of these jobs, like auto manufacturing, which was a generally high wage job, never really returned in the United States. And since the 80s and really since the 70s, we've seen a continuous decline of the U.S. auto industry and also just manufacturing in the United States as well. Um, and the jobs that were created at this time, even though jobs were created at this time, they were lower wage than the jobs that existed before, and it kept people in the poverty gap. And the hardest hit groups of people in America who were impacted by the wage gap continued to be African Americans and Latinos. Though Reagan's presidency was successful on a lot of accounts, the new right did not achieve its goal, all of their goals that they set out to do. And in many ways, they did the opposite. For example, the number of government employees under Reagan actually increased, right? Remember that one of Reagan's biggest things going into office is getting rid of big government. Well, under Reagan, the government actually expanded, especially around the military. Um, and With more than 80% of the federal budget committed to defense, the new right claimed to lower the federal budget. But between 1980 and 1989, the national debt rose from 914 billion to 2.7 trillion, and this is a trend that continues to go to the present day, where it's over 22 trillion, like I mentioned in our previous video. Despite steep tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, the overall tax burden on low and middle income Americans actually increased during this time. And it continued to grow for the past several decades. We have the rich paying less taxes than before, while we have the middle America, right, and the lower income groups paying more in taxes on average. However, the government still offered its so also budget cuts continue to reduce the federal support given to welfare programs. Um, However, the government still offered the neediest citizens a safety net, if now continually shrinking. So there were a lot of good and bads that took place during Reagan's presidency. So in the 80s, we see a rise of the new right in American politics, and this reflected many of the frustrations that many Americans had of the liberal social changes that occurred during the 1960s and 1970s. Reagan's legacy changed the trajectory of America forever, with military spending increasing. This idea of trickle down economics with tax cuts for the rich and big business, in theory that it could trickle down to the rest of America, continues to this day. Also, Reagan promoted patriotism and militarism, which became a core sense of the American identity for the past 40 years. Um, and uh, and we see a shift, general growth of the new right, this new, more right wing conservative movement taking place in America that continues to this day. So, all right, that's all I have for you in this video. We talked about a lot of stuff. Thank you for tuning into this last required video of the semester. I'll have a one more lecture video that I will post that you could potentially have a extra bonus credit on your final for. And that last lecture, I'll post it on Monday, and it will be about um, the 20th century, 21st century up to the present day, right? So does history, after all we talked about, look like up to this present day? So if you want to watch that, I encourage you to do that. Thank you for looking at this video, and please, I encourage you to um, finish this semester strong, finish all these assignments. Thank you so much for your participation this semester. I really enjoyed getting to know you and discussing American history with you. Good luck on your final, and if you need anything, please email me. All right, I'll see you later.